Hello and welcome to Further Inside Chor Leoni. My name is Eric Light. I am the artistic director of Chor Leoni Men's Choir here in Vancouver, British Columbia. And I want to welcome you to the show as well as our guest today, composer Saunder Choi. Hello, Saunder. It's really lovely to meet you.
Hi, Eric. Thank you for having me in your show today. I am honored to be a guest.
Well, it's I've known about your music for an awfully long time, and I keep saying this. I just use the show as an excuse to talk to people I want to talk to. So we get to just do it in front of lots of people and the whole of the internet. So here we are. Tell us, give us your biography. How have you come to this point of your musical career? Your sort of formative years growing up, and a bit of your training, and all that background stuff that gets you to where you are right now.
Yeah, so I was born and raised in Manila, Philippines. I was there until about 23 when I moved to Boston for a second undergraduate study, actually, in music. I have my first undergraduate degree in the Philippines was not in music. It was actually in communications because
Ah,
I grew up in one of those well, I would say like more fiscally conservative Asian families who
yes.
don't really want their kids to end up as like professional musicians, or maybe did not have that perspective that, oh, music can be a career. And so my parents wanted me initially to end up in business. Of course, right now they're fully supportive of what I do, seeing that, oh yeah, it is possible to make a living out of music. It's possible to have music as a career. Um, I started singing when I was 7.
Ah.
Um, and that was my first training in music. You know, it was really all about singing, and I've sung in choir essentially since then.
What
Children,
sort of choir was that when you started?
it was a children's choir that my music teacher formed with the other students, the other voice students that he has.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and I also sang in school choir. I started singing in 5th grade. I was a boy soprano then, went through the whole voice change thing.
Yeah.
Um, Sang as a countertenor for a good bit because we didn't have enough men or we didn't have rather enough lower voiced singers
Mm-hmm.
in our choir, in our high school choir. And so the director decided that it was a treble choir. And at that time, too, I started arranging
Uh-huh.
for this choir. And um, my voice teacher also happens to be a pianist and a composer. So I started learning piano and composition, music theory when I was 12 or so, right as my voice changed. I started doing that.
Yeah.
Um, and then, growing up, I was singing in high school choir. I eventually became the accompanist for some of our performances and started arranging music for the choir. They're very simple arrangements. They were mostly like pop arrangements, maybe some Christmas carols. But it wasn't like it wasn't anything to be to show. Like I wouldn't those pieces are very, very formative
Sure,
and
sure.
very basic, but it was a start in composing.
And you got to write notes down on a page, and real people sang them back, which that's an amazing laboratory to have. That especially not a lot of young composers get the opportunity to do.
It really is, and I'm super grateful for that. One of the things that I started doing also because of my music teacher um, is to create karaoke tracks. uh, Growing up, we didn't really have. I grew up in a small apartment, you know. Um, And we didn't really have any space for like a grand piano. So my
Sure.
parents bought me a synthesizer. It was a very good synthesizer. It was a Korg Triton LE, ones that you can plug to your computer. You can sequence. There's an internal sequencer. You can do up to 16 tracks. And I remember that my music teacher taught me how to like, oh, here's how you layer the piano, and you layer
Right.
the drums, and you layer the bass and string pads and etc. I mean, they were very basic things, but I was essentially realizing it now. I was orchestrating at that
And
time
arrange, absolutely, yeah, yeah.
while I'm making these karaoke tracks.
I gotta ask: are there were there any standout songs that you remember doing from back in the day?
It was a lot of medleys of Chinese folk songs ish type stuff
Uh huh.
because there's this culture in the Filipino Chinese community. Like people love singing karaoke. And every school, every Filipino Chinese school in Manila has like an anniversary celebration where the batch, 1978 to 1980 has this like 10th anniversary reunion, whatever. And of course, all of them are connected to my music teacher because they take lessons from him. And so they're like, I want to sing this song. And so my music teacher used that as a training ground for me to start arranging things. Like he's giving me like little tiny gigs that he couldn't take on. So
I just love the cyclical. This feeds that, and this feeds all the. That's brilliant.
it was a lot of things. It was a lot of things. I would say though that my most one of my most important training grounds or experiences as a musician happened when I graduated high school.
Hmm.
When I graduated high school, I had already been like playing piano and arranging and singing in choir. It just so happens that the annex campus of my high school was looking for a choir director. And so I took on that position. That's
Oh,
part A of it. And then the second part is I joined the Philippine Madrigal Singers, which is a really, really, really great choir. One of the best choirs in the Philippines, I would say. I spent 5 years with them touring, arranging for them. I was one of their resident arrangers and composers, writing pieces for them. And that was an awesome laboratory choir because they could do so much.
yeah.
I think,
Almost anything that you put down. Yeah, exactly.
yeah. And I got to travel. I got to go through to different, conferences and symposiums and competitions and stuff like that. And just broaden my perspective of the different ways that music, particularly vocal music and choral music, is
Right.
made around the world. Um, that was very, very, that was it's probably one of the pillars of my music training is my time with the Philippine Madrigal Singers.
I can imagine. When did you and how did you make the decision to come to the States and pursue another degree?
So I've always wanted to study music. I would say the decision to go to Berklee College of Music came during my last year in the Philippine Madrigal Singers. We had a 6 month long tour. We were away from the Philippines for 6 months. It was
Wow.
long.
Wow.
Um, in that tour, it was a North and South America tour. And the reason why we were away for 6 months is because I think it was like around April, we had a performance with the Mormon Tabernacle Choir. Um, and then in July was the World Choral Symposium in Argentina. And it would just be too financially impossible to fly all the way back to the Philippines, fly to the US, fly all the way back to the Philippines, and then fly to South America. So we just decided to build a tour around it. We performed in a lot of places. Um, but one of our stops was Boston.
Ah.
And there were a couple of choral musicians for really, really good friends of mine now. They used to sing in the Ateneo Chamber Singers. And of course, the choral community in particularly Metro Manila is quite tight knit, actually, because the conductor of the Ateneo Chamber Singers was also formerly a Philippine madrigal singers from the 80s. And so it's a very tight knit group. Um, I met them. They introduced me to Berklee College of Music, and eventually encouraged me to audition to apply for Berklee for schooling, which I did. And then by the spring of 2012, that was 2011 was the tour year. By the spring of 2012, I had moved to Boston and started studying at Berklee. And I spent 2 years there, um, singing and composing and doing my studies and meeting all different types of musicians. Um, and Berklee's such a special place because I'm I'm realizing it now. Maybe I didn't really realize it then, but around 60 to 70% of the students who go there are international students.
Mm-hmm.
And so it felt like a very international community with each person bringing the uniqueness of their own musical heritage into this school and using that language to create music and collaborate with other people. And that just created a lot of very, very special opportunities, and music making experiences that are quite unique and very different from like the normal conservatory training.
Well, that brings me into into the next question that I wanted to ask you. I'm not sure that a lot of folks maybe watching this, here in North America, really understand the breadth and depth of especially choral music in the Philippines. I mean the quality of the singing going on there, the tradition there is one of the richest in the world, really. And I've had chances to be around the Philippine magical singers for a week. In fact, they were up here. The first time I ever met them was up here in British Columbia. They were at the Choral Cathalmu up in Paul River, British Columbia, when I was with Cantus. And but that culture is. It definitely has intersections with sort of what's going on in North American choral culture. But it definitely has its own, at least from my perspective, has its own vibe. What I'm interested to ask you is you've now lived in both of these worlds. How would you compare and contrast what's important to and focused on in North American choral music versus what you grew up with in Manila?
Yeah, so very interesting question. It is a topic that pops up all the time. And let me just start with this preface that the choral culture in the Philippines, it may have started in the Philippines, but I think it has blossomed to the whole of Southeast Asia, because you see the same culture now in Indonesian choirs and Singaporean choirs and Taiwanese choirs. And that culture is that competition culture,
Yes.
right? A lot of these choirs, really, one of their goals is to join choral competitions. Um, and oftentimes they bring home a prize, they win, they represent the country, et cetera, et cetera. And so because of that competition nature, a lot of the repertoire that is born out of the Southeast Asian choral culture are particularly really virtuosic pieces. They're like showstoppers, often rooted in folk music. Um, I remember that one of our great composers and conductors in the Philippines, Eudenis Palaruan, coined or mentioned a term. Last year, I was in a composition panel with him, and he mentioned the term Asian polyphony. And what is Asian polyphony? If you notice, if you've ever performed any Southeast Asian choral music, particularly those that are based in folk music, not necessarily arrangements, some of them are original compositions that use folk elements. A lot of them are very onomatopoeic or uses onomatopoeia to imitate the sounds of our native instruments, like particularly gong type instruments for Southeast Asia or bamboo instruments in the Philippines too. So there's a lot of like that imitation type. And I feel like that's one of the key features and one of the identifying features of Southeast Asian choirs and Southeast Asian choral music is that it's rooted in rhythm and it's rooted in polyphony. In North America, I find that a lot of choral singing is very homophonic. It's very text based rather than effects based.
Mm-hmm.
And that choirs here are less concerned about winning competitions, but they're more concerned of sort of the academia behind choral singing, particularly university choirs, I feel. They're more into, conferences and rather than competitions.
Right.
Right. And I feel that conferences are more really education focused. And so, they're not necessarily concerned about sounding virtuosic or sounding impressive.
Yeah.
But they're more concerned about, is this performance practice accurate, or sort of that academia behind the music. That was one of my observations. We also have a lot more like community and church-based choirs here, I would say.
In North America?
Yeah, because a lot of the choirs in the Philippines, it's like a semi-professional community choir.
Mm-hmm.
It's weird because like how do you define a community choir? Does it mean that is it the quality or is it that
Right.
they're paid?
Right.
Because there are some community choirs that are really good, and I would argue that a lot of the community choirs in the Philippines are really good, regardless of whether they're getting paid or not.
Mm-hmm.
So there are a few things. We also don't really have a lot of like fully professional choirs in the Philippines. Unlike here, where singers can make a living and singing professionally, you have those singers who sing in all of these different North American professional choirs and traveling all over the place. That's not really a thing that you can do in the Philippines.
Right.
It's just not structured that way.
Mm-hmm.
Like the Philippine Madrigal Singers was never an employer, for example. It's an excellent choir, but can you stay there forever and make a living as a singer? Probably not. And that's
Right.
not what the choir wants its branding to be as well.
Sure.
Yeah.
That is all very fascinating, and having taken my own choir, Chor Leoni, to the Bali and Singapore international choral competitions, a lot of that resonates with me, and it was seeing the level at which that competition was, the seriousness that was taking competition, and frankly the award ceremonies, they were amazing. I was just blown away the first time I saw that in Bali in particular. But taking all of that in with what you've just said, now you are writing music, and your music is being performed in Southeast Asia. It's also being performed all over North America. It's probably being performed in Europe. It's being performed, we live in a very global place for, for somebody like you, for their music to be done. How are those worlds that you've walked in, and those maybe a little bit different aesthetics or slightly different shades of values of what each of those cultures wants out of choral music. How has that informed how you write and what you write in your own music?
So living here in America has definitely informed a lot of the more social justice focused pieces that I've been writing.
Mm-hmm.
Because, frankly, I'm living here as a person of color. I'm living here as an immigrant. And I'm living here as a minority. And, BIPOC folks don't have necessarily the best experience in America. And a lot of that, of course, resonates with me. Plus, I'm working at a Unitarian Universalist church where this racial justice, social justice training, climate justice, it's all being introduced to me, or it's all part of my world from week to week. I also sing in tonality, who's main
with Alex Blake, yeah.
Alex Blake.
Yeah.
In fact, Alex and I went to school together when that whole started, as we graduated from USC. And so a lot of that has, informed me of how important it is to advocate through our art, which is not something necessarily that I did when I was back in the Philippines. A lot of the choirs in the Philippines, I would say, have stayed away from more politically pointed music.
Uh-huh.
And especially the Philippine madrigal singers, because they're associated with the cultural center of the Philippines, which is part of the National Arts Division, and they're one of the resident choirs there. The Philippine madrigal singers go out of the Philippines to represent the Philippines all the time, and so
as ambassadors, yeah.
As ambassadors of goodwill, one of the tours that we had, we were awarded the UNESCO Artists for Peace in Paris.
Mm-hmm.
And so they don't necessarily want pieces that comment on the government in a very pointed way.
Sure.
Yeah. A lot of the messages, or a lot of the repertoire that I've written for the Philippine madrigal singers is either like folk song arrangements or pop song arrangements, or something that has a more universal theme. Mm-hmm. Of peace, of love, of hope, of faith. Because the Philippines is a very Catholic country too, so there's a
lot of religious music. Yeah,
there's a lot of religious music, oftentimes in Latin, actually, because we love our Latin choral music, and Filipino composers continue to compose that music nowadays. I would say that being working at a Unitarian Universalist environment now, that became less for me.
Sure.
I continued to lose interest in writing in Latin. I gained a lot more interest in writing commentary pieces, sort of more socially relevant pieces. Mm-hmm. To my detriment, because a lot of the pieces that I write, probably I don't know if choirs in Asia, for example, or choirs in Europe might be able to program music like that. Like the New Colossus is a very American-based text.
Well, for sure, it's on the Statue of Liberty.
So
but when you say that they're not able to, do you mean what do you mean by that?
it's not that they're not able to, but I don't know if their audiences will be able to connect to a piece like that if they chose to perform it.
Hmm.
Like, I just don't. I'm writing a set of pieces right now called Songs of Immigration, which includes New Colossus. It includes a new piece that I wrote called Welcome Table, um, and Invitation to Love. Well, Invitation to Love is a little bit more universal, and that can certainly, resonate with Philippine audiences or audiences outside the US. But something like New Colossus, I can't imagine a choir outside of America singing that and that text resonating with their audiences because it's a very
That's
specifically American text.
that's fascinating.
I don't know. Maybe I'm
And
wrong.
well, but I think this is really interesting to me because here we are in North America, and we're programming. Many of my colleagues were programming music from composers from all over the world and talking about certainly issues that are happening. If you're talking about issues that are happening domestically, but also things that are happening either historically or whatever. Do you think that do you think there's a difference in how a North American audience is going to maybe even take in, something that happened historically from another culture at another time, that's not connected to them here in North America versus how that might be perceived in Asia?
Perhaps if America finds a better solution for its immigration problems, then the rest of the world might have some time to process and comment on it. Um, but if it's currently happening, I feel like it's so difficult to do that. Like if a European choir decides to program New Colossus, how would they contextualize that
Yeah,
in terms of
exactly.
like, how would they make their audience care about American immigration policies? Um, maybe it can be done, but uh, I'm not sure.
That makes great sense to me because even in being in Canada, there's pieces that I've looked at that I almost wondered if it wasn't necessarily even the right choice for having Canadian voices saying what might be a particularly American problem,
Right,
versus when an American choir sings that, they're looking inwards, they're looking at yourselves. Whereas if we were across the border, we're kind of pointing the finger and well, you guys get your act together about gun
right.
control or whatever that is. It does change how the message is delivered and its meaning. I think
Right.
that makes a great deal of
And
sense to me.
and there are a couple other pieces that I've sung that fall into that category. For example, is it Karen Siegel's Why Do We Love Our Guns? Um, I don't know how that will resonate in outside of America because
Hmm.
America's the only country that loves their guns, right? Or Joel Thompson's America Will Be.
Right.
So if it's sung outside of America, I don't know. I feel like that's more of like an internal reflection type of thing, rather than something that might work globally.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Yeah, and and I have to say now that I'm living in Canada that the differences, people make jokes, of course, that it's kind of the same, but it's not, and there can be some othering there, and it's something that I certainly have to think about when I'm programming. I may find the seven last words of the Unarmed to be one of the most powerful pieces of music for male choir that I've ever heard. It is, but I'm not sure it's the right thing to program
yeah,
here.
right,
And when I take my choir on tour to the United States with the Canadian choir, it really really changes
yeah.
how that works. Now, I want to ask you one more question before we wrap this up, as I find all this just really fascinating. Clearly, no place is perfect, right? There's problems in the Philippines, there's problems in America, and you have I would guess a really great vantage point to see all of them and compare and contrast in ways that I could only dream about. But you're also kind of saying that a lot of the choirs there might necessarily shy away from programming in that way. You as the composer, do you feel any responsibility to push the folks in the Philippines to do music? Maybe it's not about the exact same things in the United States that would not be relatable, but would be relatable there. Likewise, do you feel that any sort of responsibility, or and I wonder what words you would use as far as your Filipino background, bringing that to folks in North America, and like how does that two-way street work from your vantage point?
So for Philippine choirs, a little bit. I mean, I wish that we could write more sort of political commentary pieces, because, let's all remember that the Philippine independence was ushered by artistic creations. They were ushered by two books written by our national hero, Dr. Jose Rizal. Like, an artwork caused a revolution, or a piece of literature caused, or rather two pieces of literature, it was two books, caused a revolution. And so why not music? I would say a lot of the more politically pointed pieces in the Philippines are all about like Philippinisms, or like love for country.
More patriotic than
Like more patriotic stuff. And that's because a lot of Filipinos have this mentality that anything, or at least when I was growing up, maybe now it's starting to become different, but they had this mentality that, oh, anything that's created in the West is better. And so that may be a result of being under Spain for 300 something years, and
for sure
being, an American territory for a little bit after the Spanish-American War. Maybe that's the reason why that colonial mentality, as we call it in the Philippines, stuck with them. And so the patriotic songs are in fact what is needed, and maybe what is the pieces that are needed is that love for country pieces, which choirs in the Philippines have sung and have championed. But I have yet to see, I guess, a piece that directly comments on, for example, the human rights issues that happened under the Duterte presidency, or the corruption in the government. Now, Philippine pop music has entered that territory. And so if, for example, a choir decides to do a choral arrangement of X pop music that's a social commentary, then that's great. That's a step forward. But in terms of like secular pieces, settings,
like the commission
poetry,
of work.
Exactly. I don't. It's hard because it's not part of the culture to do that yet. Unlike here in America, where you see more and more composers using their platform or using their art to advocate for values that they believe in. Yeah.
It's really, really fascinating. I want to thank you so much for this dive into these ideas. I think there's a lot to unpack here, which is always the case with a good conversation. But really, really fascinating, and thank you for your just your thoughtfulness on this, and the contributions you're making to all of us with your compositions and your work.
Thank you so much for having me and for this space to talk about this.
Thank you very much.